Okay, Jeff.
Good evening. I'm Jeff Badnock, and on behalf of the University of Montana Alumni Association and the Community Lecture Series Committee, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the 2022 University of Montana Alumni Association Annual Community Lecture Series. This series was established more than 20 years ago as a means to give a spotlight to the many amazing faculty at work researching and lecturing on the university's campuses. The series shares with the community the cutting-edge work in the arts and sciences for which the university is so well known. Like last year, we are mindful of your health and are hosting this year's lectures online via Zoom and Facebook. We all hope that next year's lectures will be before a live audience. Since this is not a ticketed event this year, the Lecture Series Committee decided to offer the series to the public at no charge. To support this generous offering, the Lecture Series Committee is grateful to acknowledge the support of First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, Kitty Robbins, and an anonymous donation in honor of former President George Dennison and Jane Dennison as this year's lecture series sponsors. If you enjoy these lectures and wish to support them now and in the future, please feel free to visit the Alumni Association website and make a donation of your own. As always, these lectures are the result of a lot of work on the part of the Community Lecture Series Committee, made up of Kitty Robbins, Joe Batt, Robert Stubblefield, Chris Comer, and Peggy Coeur. Jody Moreau of the Alumni Association office and student Lindsay House have provided indispensable support in the organization and production of the series. The committee has chosen for this year's series the theme, Our Environment Matters. From the waters of Montana to the wildfires of the Northwest, this year's lectures will explore human impact on environmental sustainability and how changes in the environment affect our lives and how we live in the world. This year's series will showcase 6 of UM's finest professors as they share rich and exciting research happening at the University of Montana and beyond. As always, following the lecturer's presentation, there will be an opportunity for members of the audience to ask questions so that our experience can be broadened. To do that, simply click on the chat function on Zoom and submit your question. If you're watching via Facebook, post your questions or comments in the comments section. We will get to as many of those questions as we can, but we will have a clear ending point for tonight's event at no later than 8:30. As always, the lecture series has received a media assistance grant from MCAT, now housed in Missoula's wonderful new public library, to record the lectures for later viewing. We don't have the schedule for when the lectures will be run, but we will announce that at a later date. Evidence of climate change affecting our planet is seen in melting ice caps and glaciers, more severe storms, and longer and more intense wildfire seasons. No life form in any ecosystem, it seems, will avoid experiencing our changing climate. This is true of animals and the plants animals rely on to exist. Life, on the other hand, is tenacious and is inclined to evolve to survive under changing circumstances. Plants certainly have changed over time as the Earth's climate has undergone changes. Tonight's lecturer, Professor Solomon Dobrowski, will address this subject in his lecture, Can Plants Keep Pace with Climate Change? Professor Dobrowski received his Bachelor of Science from UC Berkeley and his PhD in Ecology and a Master's of Science from UC Davis. He has taught at the university since 2007, and his area of research includes plant regeneration as a result of drought and wildfire disturbance. Please join me in welcoming Professor Solomon Dobrowski.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Jeff. Thank you to the Alumni Association. I appreciate the invitation to present this evening. I'm going to share my screen and bring up a presentation. Hopefully you all can see that. Okay. So the question that I pose for tonight's lecture is in front of you. It's, can plants keep pace with climate change? And some of you may be asking yourselves, well, how are plants going to actually keep pace with climate change? What does that actually mean in the context of climate change? And so my hope tonight is to basically give you some insights in terms of changes that have occurred over deep time, as well as changes that we might be expecting in the not so distant future. I want to start tonight with an image out of our own backyard here in Western Montana. This is a picture taken by colleague Andrew Larson. If I recall, this was taken in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, and it depicts forests that we see in our neck of the woods here in Western Montana. Just majestic stand of ponderosa pine. Many, if not all of us who live in this area have walked through these types of forests, and we come into these forests and we feel that the presence of these trees represent basically some steadfastness. They're so reliable in terms of their presence over centuries. And we get the sense that forests are basically static. They are a part of an unchanging landscape. Well, part of what I want to try to convey to you tonight is that whereas individual trees are indeed steadfast, they represent, they're amused to poets, they're amused to scientists like myself, but in contrast, forests are actually dynamic things. This is captured in this quote by Zach St. George that I'll read. Zach St. George is basically a writer that writes about these very topics. He says, more than any other living thing, trees are a part of the landscape. We expect them to be nearly as unchanging. We often speak of trees as symbols of steadfastness, of reliability, of longevity. Unspoken, but perhaps assumed, is that trees will receive our attention, but not require it. And as I mentioned, forests, though, are actually dynamic. And the kind of the muse for this particular talk was something that came to me after reading Zach's book, after actually a conversation with him after reading his book. He wrote a book in 2020 called The Journey of Trees. And he writes here in this quote, once a tree is rooted in one place, it's rare for it to wind up in another. Forests, though, are restless things. I find that to be a great quote. Anytime a tree dies or sprouts, the forest it is a part of has shifted a little. Through the fossils that ancient forests left behind, scientists can track their movements over the eons. They shuffle back and forth across continents, sometimes following the same route more than once. And he's exactly right. When we look at the fossil record, we see evidence of forests being dynamic. Here's an example of that for ponderosa pine. If we look here on the left-hand side, we see the distribution of ponderosa pine in the present day. And we see our neck of the woods covered in these green colors, basically representing, we see ponderosa pine forests all throughout this region. And it's one of the most widely distributed trees across the American West. It's iconic in that way. But if we rewind to about 14,000 years ago, you see that the area in and around Western Montana, there was very little in the way of ponderosa pine. 14,000 years might seem like a long time, but in the context of the lifespan of individual trees, that's not that many generations in terms of the number of generations of mature trees that actually that time span represents. If we go back to 21,000 years ago, which is the height of the last glacial maximum, when the ice sheets were coming down from the north, covering Glacier National Park and areas around Flathead Valley, we see that ponderosa pine was entirely absent from this region. We wouldn't have seen this species anywhere unless we went hundreds of miles to the south of us. And so part of what we're after here in this discussion is, how is it that forests migrate, if we want to call it that? How is it that these forests basically pick up and move to new locations, occupy new areas, and then how does that range erode over time? And what are they responding to? Here, these types of changes that we're seeing here are associated with the changes in climate that came out of basically the exit of the last glacial maximum and the warming in this current interglacial period. To describe what this process is, we got to talk about what exactly a plant needs, or what any organism actually needs. Most organisms, or all organisms for that matter, including humans, require a climate home. What do I mean by that? Basically, we have certain tolerances in which we can actually persist, and we can reproduce, and we can make a living. And plants are no different than that. This is referred to as a climatic niche in the context of a science usage. Niche, the term niche actually comes from an old French word, which means to build a nest or to have a small home. And so a climatic niche is in fact a type of climatic home. If we see in this figure on the left, the dark green in this figure of North America is showing basically the climatic niche for quaking aspen, another iconic species of this part of the world. And we see where its distribution currently lies. And we can characterize this both in geographic space, like I'm showing you here, but we can also characterize it in climate space and use that information to then make models of what that might look like into the future. And if we do that, we see that that climatic niche for aspen is marching north. The requirements that aspen have now in terms of the climate, if we look to the late 21st century, we see that those requirements are met further to the north, and there's an erosion of the range in which we're going to expect to find aspen. And so really the heart of this talk is, how is it that aspen, or any other plant for that matter, is going to get from its current distribution, its current climate home here on the left, to hundreds of kilometers in some instances to the north, where its climate home will be in the future as the planet warms. How is that migration going to occur? Is migration even the right term for what it is we're talking about that? Mr. St. George has a few words about this that I'll share as well that I thought were apropos. He says, migration is an uneasy fit. We use the word to describe the activities of individuals, birds, and mammals traveling back and forth with the seasons. The journeys of trees, though, can only be understood as a collective action. A seed sprouts and grows up and produces seeds of its own, each moving a bit ahead of the last. The species grows more common in some parts of its range, less common in others. The migration of forests, should we call it that, is the work of many generations. And indeed, that's absolutely true. It takes many generations. It takes this process from seed to seedlings, to saplings, to mature trees, and reproductively mature trees to move a forest in response to climate. And so a core question that biogeographers like myself are interested in is, can this process unfold in a way that can keep pace with the changes that we're currently seeing in terms of climate? And so that gets me right to the heart of the question and how I'm going to try to unpack it for today's lecture. So I'm going to present this in three parts. The first part, I'm going to try to answer this question. What are the dispersal rates, the migration rates for plants? What do we know about that? What are the numbers that are out in the science field? Part two, I want to try to tackle this question. Well, how fast is climate changing? We can put numbers on both of those things, then we can get a sense of, well, can plants actually keep pace with the changes in climate? And in part three, I want to try to answer this question: is there any evidence that climate is outpacing plants? And so that's the game plan. So before I go there, though, I want to answer the question, why focus on trees? Well, first off, as I mentioned, trees are the muse for, poems, for folks like myself. They have inspired people for time immemorial. The superlatives that come along with trees, the largest organisms, the oldest organisms, the tallest organisms. I mean, we go down the list. That in itself is a reason to study these majestic organisms. We can focus more squarely, though, and move our lens back and say, let's move away from trees and talk about forests. Why should we be thinking about forests and trying to answer this question of whether forests can keep pace with climate change? Well, first off, I'd point out that forests are the dominant terrestrial ecosystem on the planet. What happens to forests matters to ecological systems the planet-wide. Related, 80% of all plant biomass is found in forests. And so if we're interested in the carbon cycle, we need to know something about what's going on in forests. Additionally, forests harbor the majority of species on Earth. And so if we're interested in the biodiversity crisis, the loss of biodiversity, we need to be thinking about forests. Lastly, in this era of thinking about how do we address climate change, we need to think about forests as the natural climate solution they are. What does that mean exactly? This graphic captures it well, I hope. On the left-hand side of this shows basically the sources and the percentage of human emissions. And so you can see that they're broken up into different sectors, and all of that CO2 goes into our atmosphere. And of that CO2 that's put out every year into our atmosphere, about 60% of it remains in the atmosphere, and 40% of it gets drawn back down on an annual basis into two dominant pools, one being the ocean and one being basically a land sink. And the land sink, for it to be effective, we need to have forests that are basically pulling that carbon out of the atmosphere. As I already mentioned, forests represent about 80% of the biomass on the planet in terms of carbon on the terrestrial biomass. And so what happens to forests has a huge implication in terms of our capacity to actually enact natural climate solutions for this system to consistently draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and sequester it into living matter. Okay, and so I've given public talks before. I want to go through some kind of core points that I think are important to reiterate. So first is that climate change is real. We see the evidence. We see this strong linkage between carbon dioxide concentrations and temperature, and we see that in the historical record. Second, the changes are dramatic. If we look back over 400,000 years, we see that for most, if not all of that interval, CO2 concentrations never really rose above 300 parts per million. And here, starting around 1950, it shot right above 300 parts per million. And as of the last time I checked a couple days ago, we're looking at 417 parts per million. How do we know that those CO2 concentrations were below that 300 parts per million going back in time? Well, we know because we can basically extract that information from small air bubbles in the Antarctic ice sheet, and that's what scientists have done. There's broad consensus in the patterns that we see. There have been multiple institutions from many countries that have all shown similar reconstructions of the temperature patterns that we see across the globe. Here is just a selection of them. You notice these plots are all right on top of each other. Over 97% of scientists agree that climate change is real and that it's human caused. And a key thing that I would like to emphasize here is that we've known this for a very long time. And I don't know if this is something that the public really appreciates. So I've taken a selection of some of the science that represents the history of this, going back to some of the early parts of this. So if we look at the far left, this is a paper by Jean-Baptiste Fourier, who was a mathematician that worked for Napoleon. In 1827, he wrote an article that basically described the role of the atmosphere in making basically planet hospitable. And he's one of the first, if not the first, to basically describe the atmosphere using an analogy of basically glass panels in a greenhouse. If we fast forward about 30 years to a seminal paper by Eunice Foote, who was a physicist, an American physicist, she was the first to basically empirically show that CO2 and water vapor had a radiative effect on warming. But because she was a woman, she didn't present that material herself, and her work, until almost recently, very recently, was basically unknown to the broader community. Her major advisor presented her work in some of these early conferences. And the credit was initially given to John Tyndall, who was a British scientist who published some work a couple of years after this that showed definitively that water vapor and CO2 had a greenhouse effect. Let's fast forward to the 1960s, where we look at the work by Sakura Manabe, who was a physicist that basically was one of the first to develop simple atmospheric models that showed that CO2 had an effect, a warming effect. And the expectations were that after solar loading or solar radiation, CO2 concentrations were one of the biggest impacts in terms of radiative forcings on the climate system. And in fact, this past year, Dr. Manabe was awarded the Nobel Prize for that work. If we then fast forward to 1975, the year after I was born, this is work by Wally Broker, published in Science, which he, using a simple atmospheric model, showed or estimated that as of 2010, this is work that was published in 1975, he estimated that in 2010, the atmosphere would hold about 403 parts per million, and that effect, that CO2 concentration would have roughly a 1 degree, would result in a 1 degree increase in the average temperatures, 1 degree Celsius increase. How far off was he? Well, in 2010, there was atmospheric concentration of CO2 was roughly 390 parts per million. And he was almost right on the dot in terms of the actual effect on warming. It was roughly a degree of warming at that point. And so for the entirety of my lifetime, we have had the scientific knowledge to know that increasing CO2 concentrations is going to result in warming. Okay, now let's get back to the regularly scheduled program. I emphasize that because I just want to point out that what we see in the news today is not novel in the context of what scientists have known and what have studied for a long time. So let's tackle the work at hand. First, what are dispersal rates for plants? Well, one thing we know is that animals are actually very good at moving. This is an animal that I brought into this world. His name's Winter. He was born in 2012. He's about 1 here, if I recall, and he's doing a pretty good job moving, even at a very early age. A few little stumbles here. But what I did is I measured the distance that he is moving here and the time that it took him to do it. And using a simple back of the envelope calculation with some pretty basic assumptions, he, at age 1, if we extrapolate that out to a yearly basis, could move almost 1,200 kilometers per year. Animals are very good at moving. Plants, on the other hand, not so much. All organisms, regardless of their plants or animals, have one portion of, or at least one portion of their life history that's mobile. And for plants, it's seeds. But of course, we know that after that seed is set, it's static, and it's basically going to be relegated to the environment that it's located. Now, of course, for every rule, there's an exception. Some plants are actually very good at moving. So for example, the coconut has evolved to basically distribute itself for long distances between islands through the structure that it's developed. But by and large, plants not so good at moving or migrating. If we want to estimate the maximum dispersal ability of plants, their capacity to migrate, if you will, there are 2 things that we need to know. We need to know how many of dispersal events and the distance covered by each event. I won't go into all the details here, partly because I'm already behind in terms of keeping on schedule for this talk. But what I would say is that if we do that back of the envelope calculation, looking at the literature as to what some of these dispersal distances are and the time it takes to mature before a plant becomes sexually mature, we can make a guesstimate that the maximum velocities that plants can move anywhere from about 1.7 meters to 1,500 meters per year. And that's so dispersing a seed and establishing. Of course, scientists don't like to do back of the envelope calculations. They like to do those and then go find evidence in support of that. So this is work that was published in 2013 that pulls together information from a lot of different studies and shows actually observed migration rates, dispersal rates for plants. And the take-home message from this is that by and large, across a whole number of different life forms, whether they be grasses, herbs, shrubs, trees, dispersal rates for plants are roughly all under 1 kilometer per year, and many of them notably so. The other thing to point out here is that trees stand head and shoulder above the rest in terms of their ability to disperse. Why? Because trees are tall. And if you're trying to disperse seeds, having those seeds up high and then able to drift into the wind and capture that wind and move off is key compared to having short stature and trying to do the same. And so trees, if we're going to ask this question about whether organisms can actually keep pace with climate change, trees are a good model to actually explore that. We can also look to the paleo evidence I was talking about previously. We know from the paleo record, we have records of where the fossil pollen records kind of ebb and flow over time. And so people have dug into that literature and also tried to estimate what are the migration rates that these trees have shown over the last 20,000 years, for example. And the bottom line there is that it also is under 1 kilometer per year. So in a nutshell, that's a high-level answer to this question about what are the dispersal rates for plants. They're under 1 kilometer per year, and many notably under 1 kilometer per year. But let's just keep things loose for this comparison. Okay, now we're going to move into some different content, which is the second question. So part 2, how fast is climate changing? When we think about that question, we often think about figures that look like this. This is showing global surface warming, so average temperatures across the globe as a whole over the historical record in black, so the observational record, and then projected out into time using a suite of global circulation models, global climate models, under varying emission scenarios. Some suggesting that things are going to change very rapidly if we don't curtail our emissions, some showing that things are going to plateau or even improve, possibly, if we actually reduce those emissions and dramatically. The thing that I want to point out about this is that, this does not lend us a lot of insight in terms of how organisms are going to respond to climate change. We kind of need to know that. And there are a number of key considerations when thinking about that. This is a global average. And yes, we can look at, and say, the temperatures are going to increase by X number of degrees per decade over the next globally. But we know that context matters in the context of where you are as an organism and your traits. And so part of going after this is we need to understand, well, what is it that organisms can do in response to climate change? And so we can break that down into these 4 options. An organism like a plant, a tree, can tolerate the changes, stay put and tolerate them. They can adapt to changes. Increasingly, we're seeing that there's evidence that natural selection is acting upon organisms in relatively rapid ways that could select for traits that may be more amenable to adapt to those changes in the future. Organisms can move to suitable conditions. That's really the focus of this talk. Lastly, organisms can go locally extinct as well. And that's a real worry for a number of systems, particularly for trying to maintain biodiversity across the planet. But we're going to focus on this particular approach, or this option, which is move to suitable conditions. And so context matters in terms of where you are and how you're going to respond to climate change. We can think of this in the context of, well, how far do you have to move to ameliorate 1 degree Celsius of warming? This is just a thought experiment. And so this graphic kind of captures this thought experiment. Here on the bottom of this is basically a representative of, let's say, the Great Plains, a flat environment. If you're in the Great Plains and you want to ameliorate 1 degree Celsius of warming, you need to migrate roughly 145 kilometers to the north to accomplish that. Doesn't matter if you're a ponderous pine tree, an animal of any type, you need to do that to maintain that consistent temperature. If however you find yourself here in Missoula, Montana, where we have significant topography, to ameliorate that 1 degree Celsius of warming, you need to move upslope about 167 meters on average. That's roughly the hike up to the M from where I'm at in my office right now. And so when we think about how far and how fast an organism needs to move to keep pace with climate, context matters. If you are in a mountainous region, you don't need to move nearly as far or fast to ameliorate those effects compared to an organism that lives in a flat place like the Great Plains, Canadian Shield, and others. What this does is it opens up a window for us to basically contextualize climate change as a rate of change. And so let me expand on this. I just described how far does an organism need to move to ameliorate 1 degree Celsius of warming. In some places, that's far, in some places, that's short. If I were to say that 1 degree Celsius of warming is happening over the next 50 years, then I could take that distance that you have to move. In this case, in the Great Plains, 145 kilometers, and I could divide it by 50 years, and I would get a rate of kilometers per year to say this is the rate that an organism here in the Great Plains would need to move to keep pace with this change. Here in Missoula, it would be 167 meters over that 50 years, a much smaller rate to keep pace with the climate. And so we can do that calculation basically everywhere that we have gridded climate information. So I'm going to walk through this just briefly because I think it's helpful. So if we look at this bottom image here, it represents, let's say it represents temperature in Western Montana. And this square in the bottom left-hand corner represents Missoula. We can ask, where can we find the temperature, the average temperature of Missoula in the future? The future temperature of Missoula is shown here in this upper gridded map. And so just to reiterate, we can ask this question of where will we find the current climate of Missoula in the future? And so we can find that current climate in these cells here, which we call in scientific, and at least in my disciplines, we call them climate analogs. We can find a place that represents the same temperature as Missoula today in the future in these cells represented by these 3 boxes. And because we have 2 maps, one of the climate of Missoula today and one of climate in Missoula, or climate in the Western Montana in the future, we can then also measure the distance that an organism would need to travel to get from Missoula to some place where it has a similar climate in the future. And if we take that distance or multiple distances and we average them and we divide it by the time frame, let's say 50 years, like the example I was talking about before, then we can get a rate of change. We call that climate velocity. Climate velocity is effectively the rate that an organism would need to move to keep pace with climate projected for that location, climate change projected for that location. And so we've done these types of calculations the world over, and they look something like this. For Western North America, you see that basically mountainous regions have low climate velocities, values that are in here in 100 meters per year and lower. Whereas areas of the Great Plains, the Canadian Shield, the Boreal Shield, where you have very little topography, we see that those velocities really accelerate. If an organism wants to keep pace with the projected changes, they need to move on the order of 10 kilometers per year or more. And so let's get back to this question that I said, well, how fast is climate changing? The beauty of thinking about climate change as a rate using this concept of climate velocity is it takes climate change in terms of something that is not context specific and makes it context specific, and it puts it in a currency that we can now relate to the dispersal ability of any organism. Whether we're talking about the ability of ponderosa pine to keep pace with that change, or whether we're talking about a grizzly bear, we have ideas about the rates of these kinds of organisms, their ability to disperse and migrate. And now we can put that climate change in the same currency of kilometers per year, and we can compare the two. And so if we look at the record, the literature on climate velocities for at least the continental US, work that I've done shows that basically if we look at the last 50 years, climate velocities were on the order of about 200 meters to 500 meters per year, so 0.2 to 0.5 kilometers per year. And then if we look at the projections for what those velocities are going to be moving forward in time, we're looking at anywhere from 1 to 4 kilometers per year. It varies dramatically depending on where you are, but this gives you some ideas as terms of some averages. And so it will depend greatly on where you are, what those velocities will be. And so now we can get to the core part of this question. Can plants keep pace with climate change? Now we have a measure of the rate at which plants can migrate. So by and large, the evidence seems to suggest less than a kilometer per year. And if we look at the rates of change in terms of climate moving forward, those rates of where those isoclines of different types of climates are moving over time, they're moving on the order of 1 to 4 kilometers per year. And so this cartoon depicts much of what it is I'm saying. Climate change, at least as how we're understanding and representing, has the potential to greatly outpace the ability of plants to keep pace with it. Okay. Now I want to move on to part 3. Is there evidence of climate outpacing plants? And this is important because this is a hypothesis, what I've been describing. And so what we'd like to do is go out and look around in the world and see, is there evidence that this is actually occurring, that climate's shifted and has left the organisms kind of stranded, if you will, climatically stranded. I'm going to focus on seedlings. Why? Because if we're going to examine this problem, we want to understand the life history stage of an organism that's most sensitive to climate. And I'll argue here that seedlings are the most sensitive to perturbations in climate. It's not hard to think about why. Seedlings don't have access to deep groundwater. They have limited reserves. And so for a seedling to make a living, they're doing it in a very harsh environment. If you go out in July into the Bitterroot, just go down the Bitterroot Valley and you look at ponderosa pine seedlings and you measure the temperatures that these seedlings experience right near the soil surface here, and I've done this, you get really high values, 55 to 60 degrees Celsius. That's 130 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, right near the ground surface. It just cooks them off. And this is why basically mature trees, they'll produce hundreds to even thousands of seeds that'll disperse around them in any given year. And only the most minute fraction of them may survive. Some may not survive at all. Part of what the research group that I've been working with, along with collaborators, have done here at the University of Montana over the last 5 to 10 years is torture seedlings, grow them in greenhouses, expose them to harsh temperatures, to dry environments, and see under what conditions do they die. And that gives us insights in terms of a way to understand where we might expect them to basically persist out in the natural world. Now, I would like to return here to, sorry about that. I'd like to return to this, basically this same image that I started with this, of this image in Western Montana of a stately ponderosa pine stand. And I'm going to ask, I'm asking myself because I can't see any of you, but I'm going to ask, what's missing in this picture? And the answer to that question is juvenile trees. And in fact, if you walk down the Bitterroot and many low elevation dry forest types around the Western US, you'll find that in many of these places, there are mature trees, adult trees, and there's no juvenile trees. That's a very vulnerable position to be in if you're a population of ponderosa pine in this example, because you can persist as an adult tree because you have roots that are well down into the groundwater, and you have lots of reserves in terms of carbohydrates, and you can make it through those hard spells, but you can't actually keep your population going if you're not seeing regeneration, if there are no juveniles in that population. I'll show you evidence of this. This map here shows basically the distribution of forest inventory analysis plots across the Western US. Each one of these black dots represents a plot that's collected by the US Forest Service across the Western US. There are tens of thousands of these. Everywhere you see a green circle is a FIA plot, a forest inventory analysis plot, in which there are mature ponderosa pine and seedlings present in that plot. Everywhere where you see a red circle, you are looking at a plot in which there's just mature trees and no regeneration. Those are vulnerable forests. We can take this information in geographic space and map it into climate space. So this plot, I'll explain. On the y-axis, we're looking at maximum temperature at that location. On the x-axis, we're looking at measure of drought. So to the right is drier, and going up is hotter. So this portion of the upper right portion of this plot is hot and dry conditions. The bottom left is cool and wet conditions. The gray points basically represent where all of the FIA plots are in this climate space. And the red points represent where there are FIA plots with ponderosa pine in which there are adults present. And the blue points represent where there are juveniles, seedlings present. And what we see is that the seedlings are all situated down in this lower left-hand side where you're finding the more cool, wet conditions. And this hotter, dry boundary of where ponderosa pine are occurring, you have the situation in which you have adults present, but not juveniles. Like, as I said, the adults being present are basically reflecting what the conditions were like potentially 100 or more years ago in terms of when they established. But now the climate has moved on. This is evidence of, in technical science terms, of disequilibrium between where the plants are and where their optimal climate requirements are. And so here's one piece of evidence suggests that indeed, yes, we can go out into the real world and see evidence of climate outpacing plants in terms of their ability to keep up with it. This also suggests some unique vulnerabilities of low elevation to dry forest types in the West. What do I mean by that? So I just mentioned you have these adult trees present, and you see no regeneration. Those forests basically are uniquely vulnerable to catalysts of change, fire being a perfect example of what that can look like. In fact, fire is the great catalyst of change. It's what resets that tension between where climate is heading and where these organisms kind of are persisting. They have this inertia, if you will, especially long-lived organisms like trees that can really be buffered against these climate variations. They can persist for a long time, but fire comes along and it basically snaps the system back into place into equilibrium with where the climate wants to be by killing off the overstory. Of course, when we think about fire in the Western US, it's been all over the headlines. I don't need to iterate what we've all seen and what we've all experienced in terms of living in Western Montana over the last few years in particular, but the decade or more now. This graphic is basically representing the relationship between the amount of area burned in a given year and how dry it is that year. And so on this x-axis is a measure of aridity, and on the y-axis is the amount of area burned. And what we see is that what you would expect, dry years tend to produce much larger areas of burned forest across the Western US. When we look at this historically, go back to 1985, starting around the middle of 1980s to the present, roughly 20% of forested regions around the Western US have burned. So this is not a small area. Fire is part of what drives these systems, and we're seeing an increase in that. One of the key things to notice in this plot is that the relationship between aridity in a given year and the amount of area burned, it's not linear. It increases in this exponential fashion. So as we go into this uncharted territory of warmer and warmer climates, the amount of fire that we may see on our landscape is going to be jumping exponentially, potentially. And that is of unique concern, not just for us in terms of our societies, but also for those forests that I was just describing that are particularly sensitive to being vulnerable to not being able to regenerate. Climate is not the only thing that we need to worry about. 100 years of fire suppression in these forests. And I wish I could get into time to basically talk about this, but this is an important portion of what's driving the patterns we're seeing around us. We know that under basically 100 years of fire suppression, and we've actively suppressed over 98% of the fires that start out there, and the ones that escape are the ones that basically do the vast majority of the damage we see. We're selecting for fires that are burning under the most extreme conditions. And in so doing, we're allowing our forests to basically multiply in terms of their density. They're changing in composition. So for example, there's some recent work that was published recently that says that has shown that basically from the early 20th century to present, forests, dry forest types in the Western US have seen roughly a 6 to 7 times greater density, or so they're more crowded, 6 to 7 times more crowded today than they were early in the 20th century. And then the average size of an individual tree in these dry forest types has declined by about 50%. And so what we've effectively done is we either killed off through fire or harvested those trees that are most resilient to the perturbation that's really damaging them, fire. And we know that that's changed the entire fire regime. Under a natural system, fire gets into it, burns in these dry forest types, has a low severity, it creeps through the understory, it doesn't work its way up into ladder fuels and take out the entire stand. Whereas under fire suppression, those fuels go all the way up. And so the fire can climb right into the canopy, and it tends to basically produce these high severity burns that causes really damaging mortality in forests. What does this look like in real life? These are repeat photographs that come from Alan Taylor, a colleague. Here's a place in Lassen National Park. Picture taken in 1923 and repeat photos of the same locations. Fast forward to 1993, and we see this dramatic increase, 6 to 7 times on average, although this looks like it's even more than that. 2010, another repeat photo. And then, of course, there was a fire that basically resulted in almost 100% mortality stand. We can see this across landscapes as well. Here's a photo taken in 1936 where you see this patchy environment across the landscape of places where there's no forest, places where there's forests. And if we see the same landscape now where there's just a constant carpet of forest across the entire domain. And so a fire that gets into the systems now has this continuous fuel bed to move contagiously across landscapes, whereas in the past, it'd be exposed to this patchy environment where there was no fuels in some places, and that would hinder its progress. And so getting back to the question at hand, why does this matter in the context of, ability for plants to keep pace with climate change? We're experiencing the situation now where fires in these systems basically are burning at very severe conditions, and they're punching huge holes into these landscapes. This is the 2011 Las Conchas fire in New Mexico. And here we're looking at a fire that, burned really high severity, dramatic effects on this landscape. This used to be ponderosa pine forest, and now it's basically inhabited by shrubs and non-native grasses. And we see very little evidence that ponderosa pine forest is going to come back. Why? One possibility is the climate's shifted, and another possibility that's increasingly being the case in many systems because of the size of these fires is that there's no seed source. If you look at this landscape, there's no live mature trees to provide a seed source. And so now we're faced with a double whammy. Not only is the climate changing in a way that could be non-conducive for these trees to regenerate, but now we don't have seed sources. This basically calls to task our need to do active reforestation. The Forest Service just came out with a strategic document literally a month ago. Basically said in the next 10 years, this is what we want to try to accomplish. One of the things they pointed out is that this is a real problem, their ability to do reforestation. They noted in this document that they address roughly 6% of their post-fire replanting needs per year. And that as of literally a month ago, they estimate there are roughly 4 million acres of reforestation needs. And every year that goes by where we have a year like 2020 or last year, that reforestation needs dramatically outstrips their capacity to do reforestation. And so when we talk about can plants keep pace with climate change, we're facing novel challenges now, not just the climate and climate suitability, but the fact that we don't have seeds in many places. We don't have mature trees to actually populate seeds and colonize new sites. Okay. So I want to come back again to Western Montana, to this happy spot, because a lot of that's bad news. And I must admit that as somebody who does this work and who studies these kinds of systems, I'm an optimist, or I try to be an optimist. I want to look for some glimmers of hope. And so I want to leave you with some glimmers of hope. So the first thing I want to point out is that forests, like we see here in Western Montana and natural systems more broadly, they are resilient. There's clear evidence of resilience in these systems. And it's important to recognize that they're also dynamic. We see that in the paleo record, that these systems are not static, they're dynamic. They've changed composition and structure over millennia. What's going on now is no different. The thing that is different is the pace of change. And so that's something we really need to keep track of. The pace of change that we're seeing now is accelerating. And indeed, climate change, we can think of it as an accelerant for processes that have always occurred. When we think about fire, fire is natural to forests in the Western US, in many places, semi-arid regions around the globe. Climate change is an accelerant to that process. And so what we need to be thinking about is how do we ameliorate, how do we slow down or facilitate changes that are basically be conducive to the things that we need. We need to basically reevaluate what our expectations are of what the natural systems around us are today, our needs, as well as what they are going to look like looking forward. We need to accept those changes coming down the pipeline, because it's not rocket science. We know some of the changes that are coming down the pipeline. We know how some of these forests are going to shift. And we know that the paleo record gives us insights in terms of those shifts, but we also know that the paleo record highlights that periods of rapid change occurred and that ecosystems showed threshold responses to those types of changes. And what we need to do is accept those changes, potentially help direct those changes moving forward in a way that's less disruptive to the natural systems around us, as well as to our society. And so that is really the grand challenge of resource management, natural resource management today. And that's basically what we're trying to think about in terms of the science that we do here at the university, as well as what we teach our students. And so with that, I'll end with some acknowledgments for a broad array of colleagues that have really helped do the work that I depicted today. That includes Marco Mineta, Zach Holden with U.S. Forest Service, Anna Sala, professor here at Sean Parks, also with U.S. Forest Service, Kim Davis, research scientist here, and many others that I'm not listing here. And I also want to point out the funding sources that help support the research that I showed here today. So with that, I'll stop sharing, and I thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Solomon. That was fascinating. There was a lot of things there to digest. One of the things that I kind of launched with my remarks was the tenacity of life, that where life can live, it will. Mm-hmm. And it kind of seemed to me that the theme that you were carrying on tonight is that climate is changing, and that is going to change where the trees and the plants that we all know and have learned to live with are following that change the climate. But that also suggests that something is coming behind it. Yeah. That there are things that never grew here before that are coming that may grow here.
Yep.
Um, I have a friend who started a winery here several years ago, and in the 1970s, if you told me that there was going to be wine growing in Missoula, Montana, in the Rattlesnake Valley, I would have laughed at you. But it's been very successful. We've got wine growers, grape growers. So, do you have any comments about the plants and the environment that's going to be following the change?
I do, and if you allow me to basically show a couple slides, I went right after that question and it tied in with some of the stuff I presented earlier. Let's see if I can actually share my screen one more time, and I'll move to this slide. So the slide on the left basically is what I was describing earlier, where we talk about what I'm calling here a forward analog. It's where are these places that we'll find, in this example, Yellowstone National Park. I'll use that as example instead of Missoula. Here we're saying, where will we find the current climate of Yellowstone in the future? And that's basically what I was talking about, is these forward analogs or climate analogs in the previous. These are the places where the organisms in Yellowstone today need to move to basically maintain their current climate. But a similar kind of thing, but with a slightly different twist, we can ask the question, where can we find the climate of Yellowstone's future today? And we can do that calculation as well. We call these reverse analogs. So I'll repeat that. Where can we find the climate of Yellowstone's future today? And if to answer that question, we see that the climate of Yellowstone's future today is basically situated in the foothills above Pocatello, over by Moscow, Idaho, over towards more eastern Montana. So warmer, drier environments. And so to answer your question, we can look to these places that are reverse analogs, these places in the foothills above Pocatello and over towards eastern Montana. We say what organisms are there and that are pre-adapted for the climate that's coming to Yellowstone, and that could actually disperse to Yellowstone, and we can go after trying to describe what those are. And so we see them. We see that these are forest plants that are basically more adapted to hotter, drier environments. We're talking about juniper, we're talking about other types of shrubs and so forth that we currently don't see in Yellowstone that potentially can migrate into Yellowstone.
All right. Well, we have had a number of questions submitted. And in one viewer asked the question in thinking about your dispersal calculations. Do your dispersals mapping and modeling, do they take into account seed dispersal by birds and animals and other means other than just the seeds dropping from the tree and getting caught by the wind?
Yes. So first off, they weren't my calculations. They were a review, a broad literature review across a number of studies. I think it was about 150 species and many different samples. But you notice that there was a broad distribution associated with, trees, and there was a broad distribution of rates associated with shrubs. That distribution reflects a broad array of different dispersal strategies, whether they be by wind, whether they be by water, whether they be by animal, and so forth. And so I didn't show another graphic which basically depicts different kind of dispersal syndromes. And indeed, we know that plants are dispersed by a broad array of vectors, including animals, and animals can move long distances. But by and large, that's where the state of the science currently is. And we also know that there's other things called these kind of low probability but long distance dispersal events, which may be kind of pivotal to leapfrogging organisms into the future, but they're very infrequent and they're hard to measure. And so we don't really have a good number on what those things look like.
Mm-hmm. We had another viewer make the observation that it seems like the regeneration of trees like the ponderosa pine is limited by lack of ground scarification through low intensity fire and also wildlife browse. How much are those things a factor in the health of ponderosa pine forests?
They are clearly they're a factor. I mean, the person who asked the question is accurate that pine regeneration in particular benefits from scarification. It benefits from low intensity fire clearing, competition from grasses and other types of forbs. Pine need they need sunshine. They're not shade tolerant in the same way that other tree species are. But despite those things, we studying this type of these types of systems post fire see that in situations in which we're not dealing with the types of competition, or at least extreme competition from dense overstory, we're not seeing the type of regeneration that we would expect after fire, in which we have bare mineral soil. We have in places where we actually know that there's mature seed sources, there are places where we are not getting regeneration. And we've shown through various studies that these seedlings really have crossed, in some cases, these climatic thresholds in which they can actually make a living.
In the research, do you see any evidence of the pulses of seedling establishment occurring in wetter periods over several years? Or how frequent does that occur in the past and in the future? I mean, if we went through a 10-year wet cycle, or where it wasn't as dry, would we expect to see that affect the size and migration of the forests?
Yeah, and so if you look back at the work in this domain, particularly with a dry forest type like ponderosa pine, we see if we age seedlings, in which we've done this work, you do see pulses. It's painstaking work to age seedlings and do the dendrochronology, but we've done that work over large regions of the Western U.S. in areas that are burned. We look at the literature from the past, and we see that recruitment pulses with ponderosa pine particularly are tied to these pluvial events where you get a cool, wet stage. But here's the challenge, is that if you look through time and we look at the amount of precip or the temperature, some years are hot, some years are cool and wet. It goes like this through time. And we expect those pulses associated with, where it's cool and wet. But the problem is that the overarching pattern is up, meaning towards hotter and drier. And so if we put a line in here as to where ponderosa pine seedlings can actually make a living, anywhere you fall below that line, you're doing okay. You might get a recruitment pulse, but by and large, it's like an escalator. You're moving your way up, and you're going to spend more and more time above that threshold where you have conditions that are drier. And so we've shown this in publications that indeed this annual variability is pivotal to the dynamics, but all of that pattern is showing, at least in some low elevation dry forest types in burns across many regions of the Western U.S., that we've crossed that threshold in many of these systems, and that we're marching towards a place where there's less and less recruitment.
Well, since the people who are watching, for the most part, I'm guessing, are living in or from Western Montana, and the care that we all have for the forests around us, either for recreation or for logging, or because we like critters, we like the fact that we live in an environment that has that. Is this material that you presented today, is this becoming what one might consider the mainstream thinking? Is this what is being taught at the forestry school now? I mean, you're not an outlier in this, are you, or are you?
No, I'm not an outlier. I mean, this is by no means novel. There's novel components of this, but you can go back to literature published in the 1920s, 1940s, 1950s, and I've looked at some of this literature and had grad students looking at the literature. The knowledge that foresters in particular have known about the requirements for organisms or for tree seedlings to basically produce, something we've known for a long time. There's experiments from the early 1900s where they would expose tree seedlings to these high surface temperatures, and they'd see, where do you get to the point where you cook them off and they're no longer surviving? Foresters have known for a long time that on a south-facing slope in these kinds of settings, you need to put shade cards up because the soil surface temperatures get hot. So hot that it'll kill the seedlings that you're planting. And so what I'm talking about is not something that is novel in that context. Foresters have known this for a very long time. What we're doing is basically refining our capacity to basically put hard numbers on it, translate what we know from what foresters have known for a while at the stand level, and extrapolate out over to landscape and regional contexts, and to think about this in a biogeographic context. So where in this distribution of where ponderosa pine, for example, is making a living, do we expect these failures in regeneration to be occurring? Where do we expect these transitions to other forest types to occur? And so that capacity is novel. And that's come with basically novel data sources and, you know, the revolution of what we can do with modern computing, as well as, go ahead.
Yeah, that prompts the question then that came from one of our viewers. In the report of the Forest Service about its needs to get into reforesting and planting, is the Forest Service cognizant of this migration influence? Are they reforesting in front of the migration of any of the tree species? Are they factoring in this research that you're talking about into their planning?
The answer is, well, it's a nuanced answer. The Forest Service is entirely cognizant of the stressors that we're talking about and this shifting composition, shifting structures of these forests. You know, the majority of the Forest Service budget every year goes to basically fighting fires now. And so their ability to be on their front foot and be proactive is increasingly challenged because of their need to react to the stressors. So yes, they are aware of it. Are they planting out on the forefront of this? This touches on some controversial topics, if you will. So our legacy, our ability to prognosticate and forecast as to what's going to happen if we move organisms to places that they weren't historically at has been ripe with failures and problems associated with moving invasive species, food web effects where we put things in the places that they don't belong. And so there's a lot of apprehension about moving organisms. That's called assisted migration or managed relocation, moving organisms in advance of their needs. And so there's definitely a lot of conversation in the literature about this in scientific circles. The Forest Service at this point has been more hands-off about making active decisions. They are doing experimentation about where they, for example, garner seed sources to plant in areas. But I wouldn't say at this point that they're just dramatically starting to move, ponderosa pine, kilometers north of its existing range, for example.
Well, similarly, the question came in, do you know of any monitoring efforts of natural reforestation rates under our altered climate regimes, say following the catalyst of change from the fires in the Bitterroot Range near Hamilton in the 2000s and the 2018 Carlton Complex fires near Lolo?
So the that Bitterroot Complex fire that occurred in the early 2000s at the southern end of the Bitterroot, that's an interesting example that you just mentioned. So there were places in those fires on the southern Bitterroot that we're looking at now 20 years on now from when that fire occurred, in which we still are not seeing natural regeneration in some of those places, both due to the fact that you're far from natural seed sources, and after active planting efforts by the Forest Service in the region, some of those have failed. And so even here in northern Rockies and Montana, we're not immune to this. Like I showed an example from the Southwest, but we're seeing the types of stressors that we're talking about here in our own backyard. In terms of monitoring efforts, yes, the Forest Service does do types of monitoring. I already mentioned some of the monitoring data through the FIA program. They also, after their planting efforts, they monitor the success rates of some of those plantings, at least here in Region 1, as well as elsewhere. And so, yes, there's data to support some of those efforts to understand, well, what are these regeneration rates, and are they trending in a negative way or otherwise?
Interesting.
I mean, just to give you some context, though, it's like in 2020, we were looking at roughly 10 million acres that burned in the U.S. And so if you do some quick calculations, if you expect that maybe 10% of that occurred at high severity and require replanting efforts, we're looking at 1 million acres, a single year that just pops up and says, we need to reforest this. And we also know that there's a window of opportunity after a fire in which you have that bare mineral soil. You don't have all those invasive grasses that are basically competing with seedlings. And so all of these stars need to align. You need to have that opportunity for the seeds to get there. You need to have the conditions. You need to have basically enough moisture for those seeds to basically germinate, to set seed, germinate, and then get through the gauntlet of that first year, get their taproot down to basically a groundwater source. And so the alignment of the stars here become less and less likely as we stress the climate, as we punch bigger holes into our landscapes and make it harder for seeds to move into these places.
Yeah. We had one of our viewers make this observation. It seems that ponderosa pine are somewhat an indicator species for climate change across the inland West. Is that a reductive view, or is that accurate? And what are some of the other indicator species that you've come across, flora and or fauna?
It's an interesting question. I've never heard of ponderosa pine being considered an indicator species. As I mentioned, it's one of the most prevalent tree species, but I think it's an interesting observation in that it's in this unique setting right at this boundary between shrublands or grasslands and the forest biome type. And what we find is that in these ecotones between different kinds of biomes where we see dramatic transitions. I mean, if you go to the Front Range, whether we're talking here or down towards the middle and the Southern Rockies, the Front Range is dramatic, and you move from this, ponderosa pine or forest type down to grassland. It's a stark boundary, and these boundaries do give you unique insights in terms of where you expect these changes to occur. We expect climate change acting as an accelerant through fire and through other means to basically erode that low elevation boundary. Why does that matter? I mean, oftentimes we hear about climate change, we hear about plants moving up to the tops of mountains. I've spent a lot of time focusing on the bottom edge of forest ranges because two key reasons. I do think it's really an indicative, particularly when focusing on where the seedlings can make a living, because that's the most stressful environment. And secondarily, any change in where that boundary of where that forest boundary is along, for example, the Front Range, any movement upslope represents a massive area in forest, because there's a lot more surface area at low elevation than there is at high elevation on mountains. And so small changes in the boundaries there can amount to dramatic changes in forest area. And so from that context, I'd say, yeah, it's an interesting observation. It could be an indicator species. Other indicator species, for example, pica are one that's often pointed to because they have narrow thermal tolerances. Amphibians are often pointed to because they have also narrow hydrologic requirements. Salmonids are good examples of that. We see they have narrow requirements in terms of needing cold water. And so those things that basically require cold, persistent moisture are often the indicators that we're looking at out there.
Yeah, I was just the other day involved in the Wildlife Film Festival. They're judging some shorts, and they had a film about wolverines, which is one of my favorite animals that I've never seen in the wild. But their climate is changing, and their habitat and where they can range is being threatened by climate change. And so that's another species.
That's a great example, because wolverines, another good example of highlighting a specific life history stage that an organism needs in the context of climate change. So I gave you an example of a specific life history stage for trees, little seedlings. With wolverines need deep, persistent snowpack for denning. And we're increasingly losing that across vast swaths of at least the lower 48. And so consequently, it's really threatening potentially their distribution and their ability to make a living.
Yeah, amazing animal.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've gotten to the end of our questions. Solomon, I want to thank you. This has been fascinating. I can tell that just from the questions that we've been getting that people were really engaged in what you had to tell us this evening. And I thank you very much. It's really exciting. I'm very proud of my alma mater that we have people like you doing your work there.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
It's just part of the whole reason why we have this lecture series is your work is important. We want to share it with the people of Western Montana. We want them to know what's going on at the university, and that serious subjects are being studied and good information is being developed.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And to the audience, come back next week. We'll have our third lecture in the series. And we do this because this is important stuff. We're going to be shutting off here in a minute. Facebook is catching up with us. But Solomon, if you'll stay on for a little bit after we close everything out, we need to do a little debriefing, and I think we'll be good. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.